I went to his rehearsal. My aunt, Sissy Houston, was part of a group called the Sweet Inspiration. They were doing background work for him on his tour.
Some stories seem like they were meant to stay hidden, but then came Dionne Warwick. With a voice the world knew and a heart that had seen its share of pain.
Keep smiling.
Hi, Miss Warwick.
Keep shining.
So which arm do you...
You can always count on.
All right, let's get that sleeve up and we'll...
She finally chose to speak, not for fame, not for applause.
These little girls don't have tails and they don't walk on 4 legs. So why are you calling them what you're calling them? And they promised that they were going to start curtailing the way that they were presenting themselves on record.
But because the memory had become too heavy to carry alone. It was a memory tied to Karen Carpenter, the soft, haunting voice behind so many love songs.
All about hanging around. Rainy days and Mondays always get me down.
What happens when one woman's silence becomes another's lifeline? Join us as we unveil what until now has been a secret of Dionne Warwick and Karen Carpenter. The Silent Lifeline. On a rainy night in 1971, two women who seemed to stand on opposite ends of the world crossed paths in a small backstage room in New York. A young Karen Carpenter, wrapped in a thin coat, was curled up quietly in a corner after her performance was abruptly cut short by a mild panic attack. Dionne, who had just returned from a long European tour, happened to stop by. She caught a glimpse of Karen's eyes, and what made her pause wasn't admiration, but a sorrow she recognized all too well. She had seen that look in the mirror back in 1967, when she herself had been ready to walk away from everything. Karen didn't have to say a word. She didn't cry, didn't fall apart. But Dionne somehow knew she was slowly dying inside, day by day, and there was more to Karen than anyone knew. There were no warm embraces or formal greetings. Dionne handed Karen a cup of hot water, and Karen nodded in thanks. But that gesture was enough to ignite something that wasn't there before, an unspoken connection. They didn't take photos together, nor did they shake hands in front of crowds. That encounter was never mentioned in any poster, recording, or biography. And still, it was the beginning of something Dionne would later call a silent lifeline. Both women began exchanging handwritten letters, something already considered outdated in a showbiz world racing toward the spotlight. But for Karen, letters became a place where she could be real. The first few were cautious, just a handful of lines asking how Dionne was, a compliment or two about her voice. Slowly, though, Karen's words began to reveal the cracks beneath the surface. She wrote about singing and not even remembering what she was singing. The audience would clap and she'd smile, but inside she felt nothing. So empty she could hear the sound of her own heart breaking. Dionne never responded with pity. She understood too well the terrible trap of kindness in this industry, where everyone pretends to care just to earn extra points in the media. But she sensed something no one else could see. Karen Carpenter wasn't weak. She was fighting alone in a battle from which no one gave her permission to retreat. Some said Karen Carpenter never had real friends in the entertainment world. She lived too cleanly, too afraid of conflict, and always avoided scandal. But Dionne was different. She was the only one Karen dared to speak her truth to. One night, in 1972, Karen suddenly appeared at the door of the hotel room where Dionne was staying in Los Angeles. She didn't say a word. She just sat down, took off her shoes, and asked to hear Dionne sing a song. Any song. Dionne chose Walk On By. When the final words were sung, Karen collapsed into the chair, not crying, not speaking, just trembling. Dionne didn't ask what had happened. She already knew sometimes just having someone stay long enough is enough to save you. In that cold, high-pressure atmosphere, Dionne became the anchor that kept Karen from drifting away. She didn't offer advice, she simply listened. And sometimes she would send a small note with words full of love, reminders that Karen didn't have to be perfect to be loved. But darkness for Karen wasn't just a place to hide, it was also where cries for help were buried, and she knew the true meaning of suffering. But what exactly caused her to suffer so much? The secret behind the tears. Karen Carpenter was dealing with the pressure of being a star, but there was more beyond that. She lived in an invisible prison, and the bars were the very people she loved most. Her mother, Agnes Carpenter, had a reputation for being strict, obsessed with appearances, and emotionally distant. Dionne had once observed Agnes firsthand. Not loud, not cruel in the obvious sense, but chillingly cold. It struck Dionne how Karen, despite her fame, still behaved like a little girl craving a single word of approval from her mother. A word that never came. Dionne explained that when Karen reached out to her, most often after midnight, she never started with sorrow. She talked about simple things, a new arrangement she was excited about, flowers fans had sent her, or a funny mishap at a photo shoot. But as the conversation went on, her voice would go quiet. There were nights when she whispered that she wasn't sure if anyone was truly listening to her anymore. At first, Dionne had thought Karen was just being modest. But the longer the calls continued, the clearer the pain became. Karen Carpenter wasn't allowed to be tired. She wasn't allowed to be human. She had to be the polished, unshakable voice of her era. Always smiling. Always singing. Never breaking. The weight she carried grew heavier each day. The world adored the image of her but ignored the woman beneath it. Her biggest pressure came not from the audience, but from her own brother, Richard. He was not cruel, but perfection mattered more to him than comfort. While Karen only wanted to sing, Richard insisted on controlling the arrangements, the pacing, even her appearance and what she ate. Nothing was left to chance. There was a letter Karen wrote once, never sent, which Dionne kept safe all those years. In it, she described how even her breathing had to match the beat. There was no space left for her real feelings. Apparently, for her, the performance never ended, not even off stage. Each time she stepped into the light, she had to drag her mind back from the edge, but the world clapped too loudly to notice. Food became the one thing she could control. She began reducing her meals until they became fragments, barely enough to sustain her. Water, fruit slices, maybe a cracker. Yet still, she was expected to sing, to tour, to deliver. During a tour in Japan, after finishing Superstar, she collapsed behind the curtains. The very next day, she was back on stage because the contract demanded it. And no one really cared enough for the woman as much as they did for the star that she was. Dionne Warwick was told that there had been a night in Tokyo when Karen's voice, barely audible, trembled through the phone line as she told her that it felt like her body was eating itself. Dionne cried when she recalled that moment. She'd never heard a human being describe suffering in such raw terms. And the most terrible part was knowing Karen wasn't exaggerating. The world misunderstood. Even doctors praised Karen's thin figure as a triumph of discipline, not realizing the very discipline was destroying her. Medicine failed her, mistaking illness for glamour. At a Chicago concert, Dionne slipped into the audience unnoticed. Watching Karen perform, she had to blink back tears. Karen's frame was so slight that her stage dress slipped off her shoulder as she bowed. Her fingers shook as she held the microphone. Her legs wobbled, but her smile never left. After the show, Dionne went backstage. Karen was on the floor, leaning against the wall, her skin cold to the touch and dark circles under her eyes. Dionne gently asked if she had eaten. Karen smiled faintly and mentioned having half a slice of bread and a peppermint. She explained it helped keep her stomach light so she could sing. She said it as if it were entirely normal. Dionne tried to help. She found therapists. She even arranged a confidential appointment at a wellness center in Santa Barbara. Karen had nodded, had even agreed, but then canceled. She said her mother told her that seeking therapy would disgrace the family, that it would mean weakness, that it would bring shame. Karen was trapped in a cycle of applause and emptiness. Her audience loved her when she floated like an angel through a song. Her family kept her close but never truly embraced her soul, and Karen herself began to vanish. She didn't eat, didn't rest, didn't dream. She only performed. There had been a visit to Dionne's home in New Jersey. Karen, weary and trembling, sat on the sofa and tried to explain how she felt. She spoke of watching herself from the outside, of becoming a wooden puppet. Lovely, fragile, easily shattered, but no longer real. With tears in her eyes, she said that if one day she was gone, she didn't want to be remembered as an icon. Dionne asked her what she wanted to be remembered as. Karen replied with just one word: human. That was the moment Dionne understood the depth of Karen's suffering. She wasn't just exhausted, she was unraveling. Slowly, silently, and no one around her could or would see it. What the world never knew was that Dionne once gathered the courage to confront Karen's family. She had hoped to cause a change, to speak on Karen's behalf. But what followed only deepened the divide. That confrontation, and what it cost, left Dionne with a shadow of guilt she carried for decades. It's a story that remains buried until now. The truth no one dared to speak. Dionne Warwick never spoke through tears when she recalled her final days with Karen Carpenter. Her voice was calm, almost too calm. When she said she had tried to save Karen, the words carried more than grief. One could see that they held a personal war against a world that had failed Karen at every turn: her family, the industry, the media, and society itself. In 1978, a call from Karen Carpenter had shaken Dionne. Karen's voice had been faint, hollow, as if she were already fading. She had confessed she no longer felt anything, not the taste of food, not the joy of music, not even her own presence. Dionne had rushed to the studio where Karen was recording, but when she arrived, she barely recognized her friend. Karen's skin was colorless, her arms frail, and her eyes lifeless. It was as though the soul that once gave the world music had gone somewhere unreachable. Without hesitation, Dionne took action. She called a private doctor, arranged for immediate admission to a nutrition rehabilitation center, and offered to cover all expenses herself. But before she could leave the studio, Richard Carpenter stood waiting for her. There had been no greeting, no gratitude, only accusation. He told her she had no right to interfere. But Dionne had stood her ground. She had warned him. If his sister died in the next 2 years, she would not remain silent. Richard hadn't flinched. Instead, he spoke words Dionne would never forget. He insisted Karen didn't need a friend. She needed to maintain her image. That statement alone exposed the chilling reality of the industry, the value of appearance over life. When Dionne later recounted that confrontation, the interview room fell still. The unspoken understanding hung heavy in the air. Karen was not just battling an eating disorder. She was drowning in a machine that fed off perfection. Following that encounter, contact between Dionne and Karen diminished. And not long after, Dionne received an anonymous letter. It was unsigned, sent directly to her home, and it held a single line: a warning to stay out of the Carpenters' affairs. The message was clear. Dionne understood it too well. But even then, she knew Karen never had the freedom to choose. Karen had been conditioned to obey, to comply, because anything else could mean complete rejection. Dionne said nothing, but her silence did not surrender. 3 months later, on an autumn evening in 1980, Karen reappeared at Dionne's door. She looked worn and fragile, her body barely holding on. She told Dionne she could no longer feel autumn, that the falling leaves meant nothing to her. For someone who once wrote songs inspired by clouds and sunsets, losing the ability to feel the season was a sign her spirit was fading beyond reach. Still trying to help, Dionne quietly arranged for Karen to see a doctor in Connecticut. They met in secret, parked under trees in the middle of the night, just to avoid being discovered. Karen trembled with fear as she spoke of what might happen if her management found out. If word got out that she was getting help, her tour could be cancelled. And that, to them, was unthinkable. The world had no idea that the same voice that comforted millions was sneaking off like a fugitive for treatment. In November 1982, Karen visited Dionne one final time. She had just moved back into her own home after a bitter divorce and brought with her a cassette tape. She handed it to Dionne without much explanation, only saying that if anything ever happened, Dionne would know what to do with it. That tape was never shared with the public. For years, Dionne kept its contents a secret, out of loyalty, out of pain. But in a recent interview, she finally revealed what was on it. A voice diary, Karen's final confessions. On that tape, Karen spoke about collapsing backstage and still being forced to perform, about how her doctor had been dismissed for advising rest, and about starving herself on orders from her management. It wasn't dramatized. It was a painful truth. Karen hadn't died from illness alone. She had been slowly undone by silence. The very system that was meant to support her had watched her disappear in plain sight. Even the medical community at the time misunderstood anorexia, sometimes praising her for looking slim and healthy. The tape remains unreleased. Dionne believes the world still isn't ready to fully understand what happened. She intends to share it only when people are mature enough to see how the music industry once destroyed an angel to preserve a perfect illusion. But what truly lingers is not just the hidden diary or the long-buried secrets. It's the fact that Dionne kept her promise. A promise that needed no signature, no fanfare, just love. When the world began to forget Karen, Dionne remembered. And she chose finally to speak the truth. And she still keeps her memory. The final promise. Many years after Karen Carpenter's passing, Dionne Warwick still keeps an empty chair beside her in the recording studio. It isn't for superstition or theatrics, just a habit, a way to remember the friend who never got the chance to grow old. The friend to whom she once made a solemn promise. She would not let her disappear as though she had never existed. At Karen's funeral, Dionne did not walk up to say goodbye. She sat quietly in the very back row away from the cameras. It wasn't to hide or distance herself, but because she knew the crowd wasn't mourning Karen the person, they were mourning Karen the artist. Dionne, however, grieved for the friend she had known for more than 4 decades. The contents of the cassette tape Karen gave her were never made public. Dionne didn't keep it secret out of fear, but because she believed the world hadn't yet grown kind enough to hear the truth. She waited for a gentler world, one capable of understanding the sorrow of a woman broken by the very traits others celebrated in her: her sweetness, her perfection, and her endless self-sacrifice. During a recent interview, Dionne was asked what she would say if she could see Karen again. Her eyes remained dry, but her voice trembled with the weight of years. She would tell her that she was sorry for not pulling her out of that world sooner, but she would also tell her that she had kept her word, that Karen had not been forgotten, that she was still loved, not for the image, but for the real person she had been. Few knew that Dionne had once recorded a song she never released. It was called "The Sound You Left Behind," a bare piano and vocal track with no flourish. just the quiet ache of a friendship that death could not erase. The song was played only once, in a small New York studio, at a private memorial attended by no more than 20 people. All of them had loved Karen in silence for years. Every year, on the anniversary of Karen's death, Dionne clears her schedule for one evening. She listens to "We've Only Just Begun" alone, without interruption. It's her way of reaching out across time and silence to let Karen know she's still there, that she never left. Karen had once expressed a wish that if she ever faded from the world, people would not remember her for how thin she had become, but for how deeply she had loved music. Dionne honored that wish. She didn't bring up Karen on talk shows, didn't write memoirs filled with sensationalism. She kept Karen tucked within the quiet, private pauses of her life. Inside a small drawer beside Dionne's piano sits an old folded letter, a blue hair clip, the still unplayed cassette, and a handwritten note. It simply says, "She lived, truly lived, even if just for a brief moment." To Dionne, Karen still exists, in the voices of young singers carrying the torch, in the tender memories of those who once heard her sing, and in Dionne's own heart, where a promise, spoken once in love, remains forever unbroken. What do you think about Dionne Warwick's story of Karen Carpenter? Share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more updates. And be sure to click the next video on your screen. You won't want to miss it.